Right, I'm not intending to use the portable mic, but can you hear me at the back okay like that? Yeah, okay, great. Oh, we've got the slides up. That's not a bad start, I suppose. So, yes, I'm the Head of Infrastructure at the University of Greenwich. When I say infrastructure, I'm talking about IT infrastructure, obviously. So we, in the infrastructure group, we look after all the networks and core systems of the university that underpin all the teaching and learning activities and the business activities of the university. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you about our interesting and our somewhat convoluted journey to implement IDM. I'm also going to be talking to you about, really the theme of my talk is about collaboration and commitment and the importance of that to actually getting IDM delivered and over the line. To set the context at the start, to kind of set the scene, I should mention that the IDM system deployed at the University of Greenwich is based on Novell's Identity Manager, Novell, now NetIQ, of course. I'm also going to be talking about, so we're going to take a look at a companion system called ARMS, which is the Affiliate Records Management System. And this was developed for the university by Salford Software, who now, of course, are Proof ID, who are sitting in the audience. So if I get anything wrong, I'm sure they'll pick me up on that or can answer any of the more technical questions. So our IDM story is an interesting one. We learnt a lot as we went along, mostly about how not to manage a long-term change project, but we did learn some interesting lessons for the future. The overall outcome was positive and it was a success. However, at the time, the time frame was just extrapolating and we underestimated the resources required, and it really required an ever-increasing reliance on collaboration and commitment of the stakeholders and the suppliers to have the tenacity and the vision to pull it through. So, right, this is an outline of the talk this afternoon. So we're going to start off taking a not a macro level look, but a macro level look at the whole of the timeline, where we started, the individual milestones, and where we are now. Then I'm going to touch on the system architecture. I want to have a look at, very briefly, what it was like prior to IDM. This is to set a baseline, and then we can compare that to where we ended up, where we wanted to go. I'm not going to be digging deep into the technical details, but there are some slides with a little bit of technical reference material in case there's any questions at the end, or if you download a copy of the slides or request a copy of the slides, that information will be there. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to once more refer back to the essential role that collaboration and commitment have played in this project. And really, it was a project where the success of it hinged not so much on the technical aspects, but on the people involved. Okay, so this graphic here looks very dynamic, going towards the future like that, but this shows the overall timeline of how long it's taken us to implement IDM. Now, we've only just finished recently, actually. We finished the main integration piece in about June this year. And the IDM project started way, way back in 2007. Now, the purpose of this graphic is to show that it hasn't been a linear process. The momentum, it's ebbed and flowed over the years. It hasn't quite gone backwards. Sometimes there's been hiatus, sometimes it's paused. We had some quite difficult bits round about here about how we were going to go forward, but in general it has kept moving forward. I've marked up some of the major milestones that we had to achieve along the way, where we integrated with Novell, Active Directory, Oracle e-Business Suite, and our student record system Banner. Each one of those pieces of work, that it would be wrong to assume that these milestones and dates were all planned in advance. It was a case of we'd complete a piece and then we'd sort of reassess where we were, and then we'd have to make massive system changes around and align all our systems to actually be able to move on to the next piece. So each milestone was a hard-won battle. It wasn't quite an attrition of resource, but it did require that extended commitment. I joined here in about 2010, And at that stage, the initial phase had been completed successfully, so I can't claim any credit for that. And that was where it was implemented. It was integrated to Novell, which was our primary sort of desktop or print solution, print technology at the time. And we'd also deployed ARMS and some other sort of surrounding technologies. And it was at that point that we decided to move away from NetWare for our desktop, auth and file and print, and implement AD in it by itself, which of course was a major change project alone. And then after we completed that, then we approached the final phases of the project, and I will come to those later in the presentation. So, why do we do it? Well, prior to IDM and ARMS, we were faced with a number of challenges relating to managing accounts and user identities. Pardon me, we're probably not unique in having experienced any of these. You're probably going to hear similar stories from the presenters today. But I put up some of the more memorable and intractable ones that we actually experienced, and this was the reason why we were implementing IDM. So we had a whole collection of legacy processes and systems, and it was very ungainly, being built up organically over the years. There was lots of legacy hooks into systems and lots of single points of failure and knowledge retained in individuals. We had some very clunky manual processes. For example, every time part-time teaching staff, when their contracts renewed, instead of it just being triggered by a flag in the HR database and the contract being renewed and they would get access to systems, there was a whole process of sending emails and ringing people up, and HR staff having to tell the help desk and then the system staff, and it never worked very well. And what happened would be the teaching staff would be irate because they couldn't get access to anything, and there'd be lots of finger pointing about whose fault it was. A big issue for us was that prior to ARMS, we had a very convoluted process to provide access to anybody who wasn't an employee of the university, so affiliate type accounts. They all had to be manually approved, they had to be manually created, and it was a very sort of convoluted and inefficient process. And from an infrastructure perspective, prior to IDM and ARMS, there was a heavy reliance on lots of these legacy systems, and there was one system in particular I remember called Guacamole, which just seemed to stagger on for years and years and years, and it was deployed on an NT server, and nobody would touch it, nobody would turn it off, nobody would want to upgrade it or move it because the person who'd implemented it had left. But it was a key piece of technology that handled the provisioning of accounts into NetWare. And these are the sorts of things that stalk an infrastructure manager's nightmare. So thankfully, IDM has done away with a lot of those sorts of things. I have a couple of slides now. This is looking at the legacy architecture and the legacy systems prior to IDM. So this shows the sort of the data flow process. I'm showing you this because it will set the context for the changes that we're going to look at later on. So this first slide shows the components that went into supporting student account administration. I think it all looks quite smooth like that when it's laid out in a nice slide, but it actually belies the fact that there's a whole series of quite ancient bits of technology and scripts pulling the data through. So, for example, student records would enter a student record into our Banner database. It would be presented in a view. Then some scripts would pull that into UserDB, which was our kind of in-house IDM solution, which had a web front end that was a bespoke solution we put together. Then you had lots of very expensive system engineers sitting in the middle who then had to go in and make changes and then go and manually create accounts that weren't, or make corrections to things that weren't working. And then, of course, we've got Guacamole sitting up in the corner, like not quite a malevolent piece of technology, but just sort of a weak link in the chain. And then we were deploying another set of scripts deploying student accounts to create their Unix webmail. So at the end of all of that, if the student was still there and they were still bothered, they'd be able to get their account and they could get their access, and off they go. So But apart from the complexity of how all the individual components hung together, it was a simple system, and it worked and kind of did what it was supposed to do. And similarly with the staff accounts, we'd have a similar process. We had an exotically named process called GZapper, which would sit there and check for duplicates. Once again, the data would flow through. There would be a view presented in the Banner database. It would go into the user DB in-house IDM solution. This was even more of a manual process than creating the student accounts, and there was a lot of wasted resource with the system engineers having to create the accounts and do all that sort of process. But what I think these two sides show, and the reason I've shown them, is that when you look at this, it wasn't by any means an enterprise architectural type of information system from which sort of tracked everything from woe to go. It was incredibly difficult to build in any compatibility with other systems and services. And there was no iterative review of the enterprise architecture. So all of these individual components would either sit there and not get touched, or they'd be upgraded in isolation and then things would break. And it's very difficult to unpick the knots and work out what we needed to change. But we knew we had to do something about it. We knew we had to make some changes. So, but the problem was, there was quite a lot of things there were quite a lot of gaps, because not only were the legacy systems very complicated, but we knew that where we wanted to end up and the types of technology we wanted to use required a particular degree of technical skill, which we didn't have in the team at the time. So we were lacking in these specialist skills. Also, it's very hard to put a business case together to explain to important decision makers what we were trying to do, because all of the processes are hidden. They're under the hood. If you talk to senior management and say, oh, well, I'm going to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they say, well, what are you going to give me? Well, I'm going to give you exactly the same as you've got now, but it's going to be a bit better and more efficient. It's really hard to articulate that. So we had to find the right language to actually express what we were going to do. And we couldn't just go and buy an IDM solution off the shelf and just as a turnkey solution and stick it on a server and hope for the best. We knew that we would have to make major changes to all of our systems to align them to what we wanted to do. But the thing is, it's very easy to say that in retrospect, but I don't think we actually understood any of that really right at the beginning. So, why did we do it then? Why did we go through all, I don't want to say pain, but why did we go through all this sort of effort and cost? Well, there must have been some important driver. And the drivers were that we knew that the legacy systems were inhibiting our ability to move forward with improving processes and assigning resources effectively and assigning and integrating with lots of interesting services and technologies that were coming to fruition. We knew at the university many things are measured, probably the same in your institutions, by the student experience. And we knew that the risk and effort involved in sustaining these legacy systems, it was inhibiting us streamlining our processes, so we couldn't free up resource to then go and focus on those value-add activities. We were just basically keeping the lights on and treading water. So it was really these overriding objectives to free ourselves from these frustrations and improve and to have a positive impact on the student's experience that eventually made for a very compelling business case. But we were still faced with the question of how were we going to go about doing it. We understood our environment and we had the momentum to start, but there were some big gaps in our technological skills base to implement the chosen solution. I should mention at this point, I wasn't at the university when the different solutions were evaluated, so I can't really comment on what other things were looked at or put to one side, but I do know that we have been very happy with our choice of the technology platform in Novell NetIQ IDM, and also and the selection of Salford Software and Proof ID as the IDM integration and implementation specialist, now Proof ID of course, because when they came to the table, they they had a solution, a proposal for our affiliate management problem, and they had the deep expertise to be able to develop the solution for the university. So ultimately, we had the will, and we kind of had the budget at the time, and they had the way, so it was all systems go. Right, so I've got a couple of few slides now. This shows the architecture as it's being implemented over the different phases over the years. I'm not going to be going deep into the technical bits here, or the technical architecture, but I want to give you a flavour of how the system is being built up and the time frame for doing so. So this first slide here shows the initial implementation, which I think was finished in about 2009. So in this period, it was hooked into eDirectory, the NetWare, which was our, like I said, desktop file or print solution at the time. ARMS was deployed and was proving very successful even in that sort of early implementation. We hooked into the legacy UserDB, our in-house IDM solution, and we also deployed some peripheral connections, so an LDAP authentication service for some of our portal and other sort of web-based type of applications. And I wasn't there, and I don't know how wise it was, but at the same time decided to move all of our students into Google Mail and undertook that as an exercise. But that was all completed in 2009. So this is where I come in about 2010, and we began the before we actually integrated AD into IDM, we'd actually decided at that stage to move away from NetWare. So we undertook a massive change project to replace NetWare with AD in the core. We also decided, don't know, once again, wisely or unwisely, that we wanted to upgrade to Windows 7 at the same time, possibly because we thought that we could deploy the new desktops, which would authenticate, which would then be tied into Active Directory. And so, yeah, the technology, it all works great, but of course doing a massive change program like that, we have to go out to the university and the staff and the academics. There was quite a lot of going, toing and froing and trying to get agreement on what you had to do. It was a tremendous amount of effort from all the support teams, and thankfully it went reasonably smoothly. Now, following the migration to AD, then we did the IDM drivers, and that's been there for quite a while now, provisioning this, IDM provisioning the student accounts and the staff accounts into Active Directory, working very successfully. And there's also a bi-directional flows on some of the data. I think if you change a password in AD, then it will flow up through the vault, and it will actually make change. The changes will be reflected in, say, the LDAP authentication service. So that piece was completed around about 2012. And I think around about the time that we finally completed the AD integration, that's when we truly began to understand the scale of the work that we'd undertaken. And this is when we entered the difficult period of the project, around about 2012 to 2013. If you bear in mind that the initial impetus for the project had come in 2007, we were now approaching 2013, and we still had the main banner student and staff HR integration to complete. And these would not be completed until May 2014 and June 2015, respectively, and we didn't know that at the time. I think it's fair to say that nobody had anticipated the amount of time and resource commitment required to complete the entire project. We collectively, and supplier as well, began to see that we'd underestimated the effort involved. And I think, thankfully, internally we'd managed to make a case for some more budget and carry the budget over a little bit. And I think we'd reach agreement on what needed to be done for the final pieces of work. But this was when the project was really in danger, because it had taken us all this time to get perhaps not even halfway, and we were in danger of actually just stopping. So it was at this point that I think the value of collaboration and commitment truly came to the fore. We had to make many calls on our colleagues and the supplier to push through for the next couple of years to complete the implementation. Internally, there was a constant push by the responsible managers to get this over the line, get people working, and there were lots of technical teams contributing, and obviously we had to pull people off other projects. I actually think we got a bit lucky, and we were fortunate in that there was continuity in the project, because internally, both internally and the supplier side, which is Proof ID, there'd been some key technical people who'd been there right at the beginning. So they were able to provide that that arc of knowledge all the way through. I think if that wasn't there, then we would have been in danger of repeating a lot of activities, or probably just not moving forward at all. So finally, Banner student integration was completed in May 2014, and then this year HR was completed around about June 2015, this year I think. And so this is what we have now. This is where we are today. So following that last big push and concerted effort of everybody, we finally integrated our HR processes into IDM. So well done, hooray. But it doesn't quite finish there. And I'll come to that a little bit later. But so what I've got here are a series of slides which do dig a little bit more into the technical details. But I'm not going to stand here and read them out to you, because that'd probably be even more dull. But I've put them up here in case there are any questions at the end, and then I can refer back to them and pretend I know what I'm talking about. Or if you want to, or if you get a copy of the slides, then you can obviously have them as a reference. But so I put a panel here that explains the process for a student account and how it flows through IDM and the Vault and is provisioned, and similarly with the staff processes. Pardon me. Active Directory I've talked about quite a bit already, and this panel just provides some more of that technical information. There's quite a lot of automation and interesting business rules going on here. They're creating and populating staff accounts and moving people in the accounts into the correct organisational units, and doing that has really freed up a lot of the time of the systems engineers, because they don't have to do any of that stuff. It's just somebody registers, it flows through the Vault, it goes into the correct groups, the correct mailing groups, the correct the sort of high-level security groups based on the respective OUs, and that's been a real boon. I've also put up some information here about how we structure our user IDs. I've done that because I did mention it was one of the pain points for us in an earlier slide. Here I've got a little bit of information about ARMS. I'm not doing it justice at all with all the complexity in there. It's not a complex system to use, but it is a sophisticated system, is a better explanation. So this is, if you do have any more questions about this, you can please email me or give me a call, or talk to Proof ID, who'll tell you chapter and verse about it. But what I like about it, ARMS, is that all the accountability and residual manual tasks for approving accounts, it's all delegated down to faculties and directorates. So we're not doing it in the core. They can go and do it themselves. And so once again, that frees us up to concentrate on these value-add activities. So, great, we got IDM, but it was really hard work. So I'm going to explain quickly what was hard about it. We seriously underestimated the amount of resource that would have been required over this multi-year period. We were able to kind of stick to the budget, but only insofar as I don't think we really understood what the budget was, and we had to keep asking for a bit more money. But we did manage to keep it under control, to be honest. I don't think it got out of hand, but we did have to make additional payments for extra work that was outside of those original contractual agreements, which is understandable. But what I do worry about is the hidden cost for doing this, because it's taken so long and so much resource, so much effort from everybody involved, that if we sat down and actually put a monetary value to that, I think it would be quite a scary figure. The other thing is, at the time, it's taken us 9 years to get to this point, and I don't think I'd like to have been at the first meeting to have seen what promises were made about time. But I don't think anybody with any sense would have said, "Oh, let's do this for 9 years." It's that's just sort of crept up on us. I think the time issue is because we had to go from a standing start, and make all these changes to all the peripheral systems. So that's probably what held us up. What worked well? Well, I think we had the vision. We knew why we wanted to do it, and we stuck to our vision, and that enabled us to focus. And we were able to make these compelling arguments to bring the stakeholders along with us. And possibly we'd spent so much money halfway that we thought, well, we've got to keep going. The technology worked really well. It was probably the least problematic component of the entire project. We understood our systems very well, and the consultants working on IDM, they had that expertise. So that worked. That did work, not quite seamlessly, but it was the least problematic bit. And also the data structures. We understood our data structures, and I think this is very important. I was talking to some people in the break about data cleansing and that sort of thing. And yes, we'd already been through some of those processes. We'd done some BA work on our system processes and our data. So by virtue of that, it made it a bit easier, I think, when we went to align the systems. I think if we did make a mistake, and if we had to do it again, we wouldn't take the same approach. I think that we approached it in each of these pieces of work in isolation. It's a series of linear activities. We'd start, we'd finish, we'd drop off a cliff, and then forget about it. I think if we did it again, I want to see more of an enterprise architecture approach. We'd baseline where we are, then we'd compare where we want to end up. We'd look at that gap, we'd analyse it. If we did that now, maybe we'd have looked at it and said, well, it's too much effort and too much cost. Let's not bother. But I think actually what we probably would have done is we would have had a clearer picture. We could have made a clearer business case, and we probably could have got the budget and resource to bring it home sooner, is what I like to think, anyway. These last couple of slides to wrap up. I just want to return to the main theme of my talk, because it's not really about the technology. Like I said, that's if you were just implementing that in a closed room with a couple of people, you could probably do it in a few weeks. But really it was the importance of collaboration and commitment. So it was people collaborating to get things over the line, stakeholders and suppliers working together, keeping up a dialogue, working through the project issues in a positive approach. And if the success of the project comes down to one thing, I would say it was based on the people as opposed to purely technological or based on any sort of framework. And the importance of commitment. We had to keep those shoulders to the wheel. We had to keep pushing. We had to have that tenacity and the key people to get it done. But it's always been done in a spirit of cooperation. And then it's actually been worthwhile because we understood those benefits. We were able to make the arguments to say we were returning to that shared vision of wanting to realise the benefits for our colleagues, as staff, academic staff and support staff, and of course for our students, because they're the ultimate arbiters of success, because they can choose to go where they like. So this is where we are at the moment. We've done all of the integration work. We've got IDM, it works great, we're very happy with it. We are planning to do an upgrade to our ARMS environment, and that's being planned at the moment. We still do have to consider the skills gap, and we're trying to upskill the support staff, and we're trying to disseminate that relevant knowledge amongst the technical teams, because you do need some different types of skills that are not normally found in the general sort of systems technologists. But one of the things I think about, and ultimately I have to wonder, now that we've got all this in place, what happens if we want to change? What happens if we want to move away to a different architecture? And also, how are we going to manage the support of this going forward? I don't think we have any of the answers to this currently. I should say we're not planning to move away from it, having just gone through all this hard work, but I think it's important, particularly in that sort of enterprise architecture mindset, to think, well, you know, what's going to happen in the future? I actually think that we've done most of the hard technical work. We've aligned all of our systems. We've aligned all of our data. IDM sits in the middle, and it has these drivers, these hooks into these other systems. But everything, the hard work was all the peripheral bits around the side. So I kind of hope, oh, well, if we did have to change, could we just pull that engine out and put a new engine in and then just do, hopefully, I'm trivialising it, but do some work just to hook it in. But we're nowhere near having to do that, but I do want to think about that in the future. We also are looking at our support models. Do we want to consider other support models rather than doing everything in-house? The big problem there, of course, is around budget, CapEx versus OpEx, and our revenue budget. So it's relatively easy to go and buy a whole load of tin that you can then depreciate, and it's a capital investment. It's a lot harder to say, well, actually, we want to spend a couple of £100,000 on sticking this in the cloud, and somebody else is going to support it, but it's coming out of the revenue budget. I think our enterprise architecture approach is maturing, so I do think that we'll return to this and look at it in that sort of iterative cycle. But I do sort of think our super reliance on Novell IDM, that we do have to factor that into the equation and just make sure we're comfortable with that for the foreseeable future, which at the moment we are. I don't want to give the impression that we're not. So that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Julian Dobson, Goldsmiths University. I recognise Avery Hill Park a few minutes ago on your slide. The problems you talked about in terms of the time and sort of multiple small projects, you seem to be describing actually what was in effect a programme. And you talked about the importance of collaboration. How important, did you sort of have the concept of sort of business change managers who you were working with to actually ensure you got the buy-in and the support?
We didn't at the time, and when we talk about lessons learned, I think that we've learned a lot of lessons over the last few years, and as of when we were in that difficult period a few years back, that's when we actually started to implement and beef up our PMO. We started to have business managers. We started to return to going back to doing those sort of the proper pieces of analysis that needed to be done, and doing that, it's actually made things a lot smoother now. We do have quite a mature PMO as implementation, and that actually sits within ILS, where I work in Information Library Services. So the PMO and the head of the PMO, he's one of my peers. So management colleagues. So we actually work very closely together. We're not in opposition, and I think that's really important because I've worked in other places where you'll have a PMO who are right out on the periphery, and you actually end up in confrontation and competition quite a bit. So we've kept it in-house as such, and yes, having all of those processes, it's just made it much smoother, because before it was always the technologists, the engineers pushing from the back, and they got a completely different focus as to what is important to where the university necessarily wants to go strategically. So I'd say it's essential.
Hello, Owen Dunn, Dublin Institute of Technology. I just wondered, had you a single kind of sponsor over that period, or did that shift across the senior board?
I'm not sure who the sponsor was initially, to be honest, and I think looking back into the depths of time, you'd get a different answer from different people. I think that clarity over who the sponsor was did come after, it wasn't me, incidentally, but it was one of my colleagues, and I think that made it easier because they were relatively senior. They now have even more seniority, so they've been able to provide that support. But initially, I think it was a bit woolly. It sat between it sort of sat between a number of people. But again, I mean, it sounds obvious to say this, but if this is a lesson in anything, it's about how if you start off. unclear who owns this, unclear why, who's actually going to keep driving this forward, and with unclear processes, and then it's going to be very difficult. And as we got better towards the end, we got a lot more efficient, and that's why we, in the last 2 years, we've really been able to deliver this stuff.
Except for 9 years, you'd have a job having a single sponsor anyway.
Well, you would, yeah. I mean, it's funny in a university because some of my colleagues have been there for 27, 30 years, but in that sort of, but not in that management, not in that management tier. People have moved on. But you would, nobody would want to do it for 9 years. I mean, you'd have to be. I don't know. I don't want to say insane. You'd have to have a lot of time in your hands to want to spend 9 years doing that. I think the idea was it would be done in 2 to 3 years.
Just one more.
Christopher Hoskett, University of Oxford. I just want, am I right in understanding that you're managing your sort of affiliates separate from your sort of main people, or is that?
Well, when they're in the vault, once they've been provisioned and authorised, and they get it depends on what access they get. For example, we might have affiliates who are authorised to have login accounts so that they can log into the desktop and get resources. We might have affiliates who can have mail, but they can't log into the desktop. Right. We might have affiliates who can only access our portal. So they don't. So the whole point about that affiliate piece is that it's managing the roles of and the access of what they can do, and how it gets approved and who's accountable for it. And it is very efficient. So if there is an account that needs to get access to the desktop or Exchange, then yes, it will end up in AD. But if it's something sort of tangential, then it might not.
So do you get situations where people might sort of ping-pong between being full members and affiliates and back to full members and affiliates?
Not often, but we get more of where we have students who then become sort of they're students, but they're doing postgrad work, and then they're sort of classed as staff, and that sometimes that can prove a bit of a challenge for us. The way where we have students who migrate to being staff. So yeah, but we don't get too many of those, and it's not so much around IDM. It's more around some of the sort of the peripheral systems and how they see that, how they sort of differentiate between that identity.
Thanks.
Just one more.
Hi, Chris Wallace, UCAS. I felt a bit of a change in scenery just then when I said UCAS. Just about, slightly linked to the kind of sponsorship question that was asked earlier, but predominantly around the business case that you mentioned that at the start you felt was quite strong. Can you shed some light on what you felt the predominant factor in that business case was? Was it around student experience, or was it linked to anything else?
It was about freeing up resource so that we could be more efficient to go and concentrate on more important things, which would then add to the student experience. So you could probably do an equation that if you've got a team of 10 engineers sitting down creating accounts, that's not particularly great value. Whereas if you've got these systems chugging along, automatically provisioning accounts, and you've got 10 engineers and a PMO and all these people developing exciting things like what have we just done? CRM in the cloud, with Dynamics. It's that's where the value is.
Thank you.
Okay.
I feel like Jeremy Kyle now.
Thank you. Give it to us, sir.